This is from the book Stillpoint, and it's called The Long Birth of the Novel Stillpoint. That's how it came about. It was the eve of the Gulf War some 20 years ago, and George Bush Sr. was preparing to attack Saddam Hussein. Saddam had promised the mother of all wars. It appears he didn't realize he was poking a hornet's nest. As I listened to the news, Lao Tzu's words came whispering through time. Lao Tzu, or Old Gentleman as he was called, was a poet sage who lived 500 years before the birth of Christ. We know him today as the author of the Tao Te Ching. Listening to him was like listening to a running commentary on what was happening. Weapons, he said, are instruments of violence and fear. The wise have no use for them, except in the gravest necessity, when compelled, and then only with restraint. In victory after the slaughter of men, how can anyone rejoice, he asked. That's why the wise enter a battle bravely, with sorrow and compassion in their hearts, like those attending a funeral. I thought of the U.S. military and those who lobby for war as a first response, and Lao Tzu's words answered my unasked questions. When weapons are created, he said, the temptation to use them is overwhelming. As the build-up continued, I felt a deep sense of foreboding. It seemed we were starting down a road from which it would be hard to turn back. Although we hadn't yet realized it, the road was leading to a place of greater violence and polarization. Commentary from Lao Tzu became more intense, and I found myself wondering what he would do if he had lived today and found himself in a position to advise those in power. Thus began Stillpoint, though at the time it bore the name Mr. President. I quit my job and went on the road to sell the book. I flew from Hawaii, where I lived at the time, retrieved my truck from the docks in Seattle, bought a used camper, and began a 10-month journey. Loaded with 1,500 books, I drove north to south and west to east. But as it turned out, I was from the country, and by natural inclination, more solitary than social. I gradually withdrew from people and moved into the remote areas of the mountains east and northeast of San Diego. Needless to say, I didn't sell many books, although some are scattered all over the Southwest, left in bookstores on consignment and never retrieved. Not long after my return to Hawaii, I moved to Vancouver Island to care for my mother. At the time, I shared an office with a psychiatrist. We had interesting conversations over tea in the kitchen. I still lived in my camper and paid $1 each morning at the fish wharf for a hot shower. Besides seeing clients, I was writing a contemporary version of Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching. When I completed the several drafts, I put them in the waiting room on the table with the magazines. The title read, Something to Ponder While You Wait. When it was published, it became Something to Ponder, Reflections from Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching. Years later, a man introduced himself to me. You don't know me, he said. I read your book, Something to Ponder, while waiting for my appointments with the psychiatrist. What I found in that book stayed with me. In the meantime, Mr. President languished in a friend's basement. Events moved on, the war was over, and the old gentleman began whispering to me again. There was an edginess to life. Nasty, violent clashes like boils bursting with toxicity erupted throughout the world. It seemed to reflect the new undercurrents unleashed in human consciousness. I rewrote Mr. President and called it Uncommon Reason. Despite the fact that it won several awards, it contained a lot of lectures and discussions and had a limited appeal. Lao Tzu continued whispering. He wouldn't leave me alone, and Stillpoint emerged on the scene. I wanted Stillpoint to take readers on a journey through history into a world most knew little about. I wanted them to understand what it would be like to live through those times, not just intellectually, but emotionally as well. In the process, characters emerged that I fell in love with, others I disliked. Through it all, I hoped they would give voice to the suffering and loss, the beliefs and assumptions that lead to war and have done so for as long as human beings have roamed the earth. I wanted readers to be so immersed in the events they were no longer bystanders, but engaged participants in an unfolding conversation about war and peace. I wanted them to be able to say they learned some things and understood others, and as a direct result, the complexity of the events taking place in the Middle East was seen somehow not so complex. I wanted readers to see from a different perspective, the perspective the poet T.S. Eliot identified as the Stillpoint of the turning world, a perspective quite different from the one defined by propaganda, the one with which we're all well acquainted. I wanted readers to have a deep sense of compassion for the suffering of those caught in the tightening spiral of violence, and most importantly, glimpse, even if faintly, a path that could eventually lead to peace in the region, and to understand we, you and I, are part of what happens in the Middle East, either through our ignorance or through our awareness. Lao Tzu continues whispering to me from time to time. I've learned to pay attention. We're friends now, well acquainted with one another. In writing Stillpoint, he was always looking over my shoulder, always reminding me that when a sage governs a nation, he does not place himself above others. Their difficulties and humiliation are his own. This is what makes a great leader.